Oh, hello. How are you? Sorry? No. Sorry? No, not there. We were overseas for a few weeks, so I don't know if we like time.
I think this will resume slideshow.
I thought I'd done my family.
I get that this time. We got tube strikes, rail strikes, the hottest they ever recorded in Britain. We both got COVID. And after that, it went downhill. It was the oddest holiday I've ever been on. I've still got to contact somebody because we've been away and all the family. Yeah, no, yeah, the ones Jean was asking. Jean asked me, Paul asked me, so I gave it to that. This is a few months back. And then I went up there. It must have been earlier this year. I think I was there. I said, John said, it's a good yeah, because there's a problem.
I think we both logged in.
But the others want to have a course. So it's all like that. So Commission said it would do it. And since I got I like it, it's just been that much. I'll have contact on the other problem. I'll send them a message. So we're in a way. July. Just overseas.
Yeah. This is really weird.
You're eating food. I'm sure this is delicious.
Another minute. Okay. Start. Let me check that I'm unmuted. There we go. Hey, so thanks everyone for coming through. Good morning to those on Zoom. So something a little bit different this morning. Shackleton's voyage on the Endurance is obviously quite famous and quite renowned. And today we have the incredible honor of welcoming Viv James, who is the son of Reginald James, who was the voyage's physicist. Those of you from UCT will be quite familiar with the R.W. James building. Later in life, he came back and gave his name to the building, which actually houses the UCT Astronomy department. So that's why people are familiar. I heard a version of this talk about 6 weeks ago. And by the time we got to the part about navigating, I knew the rest of you had to hear this as well. So without taking up too much time, please welcome Viv.
Okay. Thanks for coming, everybody. One stage I was giving loads of these talks and they all faded away. But I was here, I think, maybe 10 years ago, and it was, I think, the best one I ever gave because this room was packed and the gang were outside there as well. So I hope this one goes that well. All of you being observers and stuff are quite mathematical. So now you're figuring out, wait a minute, because this thing, what I'm talking about, took place in 1914. And this guy claims his dad was on it. So I'll say you're doing the sums. I'm 81, 82 next month or so. And my dad was born in 1891. And he was quite slow in getting married, and we were not Lamekis, and I was born in 1940 here in Cape Town when he was already in the physics department. But if you're wondering how this happened, this is one massive stretch of time from 1891 to now. So that's what's the story really. And you're all wondering, why is James Weddell up there? The reason is I needed something to open the talk with, and this all took place in the Weddell Sea. And you all hear okay? You're okay then? And so I just put that up as a talk, but I think now we'll get this thing going again. Let me go back on the slideshow. I can resume. And it should come up. So again, I added that, having heard that I'm coming here, and I happen to be digging around in various things. And I found that picture. I don't know if you can read the inscription on the top, but that's 1940 October, and it's the eclipse of the sun. And that took place in Calvinia. And my dad was part of the observation team, probably some of that kit's lying around here somewhere still that they used. So that's my dad in 1940, and that's in Calvinia. And I thought that would be a good way just to start this little talk. So that's quite a historic picture, I guess. And that was in later years when he was a boss man. He was Vice Chancellor at UCT for 5 years while Dr. Davey was very ill, as well as running the physics department and as well as fighting politics and all the rest of it, trying to make Cape Town a free university. So he was a character of note, and I've put it up there so we see him. And then here is the center of the talk. That's Shackleton. My father would refer to him as the boss, and he would refer to my dad as Jimmy. So he will keep coming up. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot of history. So we'll summarize what happened here, and then we'll talk. I'm kind of focusing the talk more on my dad's side of things. So if we have a look here, Shackleton in 1914 set up the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition just before World War I started. And in fact, when World War I did start, he offered his ship, the Endurance, to the army or to the government. But the king said no. That was George V, said no, you must go. So they went, and what they did, they started at South Georgia, and the idea of the Transantarctic expedition was to get there, Bransfield Bay, and then he was going, because Scott had already been to the South Pole, Shackleton hadn't. He nearly got there, but he didn't. He was going to march right across the continent to another depot on the other side in the Ross Sea, which was being set up. And they would set up food depots quite far inland, so towards the pole. And he would then be the first person to cross the continent. Anyway, and that's another story, that expedition on the other side, which is really well worth reading about. But we're going to stick on this side. And so he sailed south from South Georgia, and they got stuck in pack ice round about here, and they battled their way south until they got there. And round about here, the ship got stuck in the ice and wasn't going to go anywhere. And then from then on, they were captive in the ice and they drifted. We're talking now of December. And then in January, they got, this is down here, and in January, they were frozen in and the ship drifted all the way up to here. October 1915, she broke out of the, well, she didn't break out of the ice broke the ship up and the ship sank. So they were stuck on the ice with just what they had saved from the ship, and they were still drifting with the ice. So the Endurance disappeared. We'll talk quite a lot about that because that's the navigation side of it and what my dad had a huge amount to do with. And she drifted north, or they drifted north with their camps. And round about here, this is the Bransfield Strait. Around here, they launched the boats and battled their way through ice. Sorry, there. They did it, and they battled up to Elephant Island. Doesn't look very far, but it took them a week to get there in ice. An incredible trip, that little boat trip with 3 lifeboats, 28 men, and very little food. So they got to Elephant Island, and within a couple of days, Shackleton took the 22-foot whaler, the James Caird, and with a crew of 5 others, they crossed to South Georgia in the Southern Ocean in a 22-foot boat, lifeboat. You'll see some pictures of it. And to find South Georgia from Elephant Island in a 22-foot lifeboat in vile weather with a primus stove heat and somehow navigate. Worsley, who was the captain, you hear a lot about him, got the boat there. They found South Georgia, the wrong side of it. So another whole epic story. Shackleton and 3 men crossed South Georgia mountains. It was only done afterwards in 1952. They got right across to the whaling station. And from there, he had to rescue his men. That's another whole story. It took 4 attempts before we finally managed to get a tug from South America. And they finally managed to reach Elephant Island and rescue 22 men, and not 1 life was lost. So that's the story we're going to talk about now and how it happened. So it's the other thing I must mention is the pictures we're going to see. They were taken by an Australian, an abrasive Australian astronomer, explorer, and his name was Frank Hurley. And these pictures were, all the best pictures were on glass slides. You know, this thing where you have a jacket over you and a big wooden thing with it. You probably got one here as well somewhere. And that's how these were taken. And they somehow managed to bring these with them across the ice. Shackleton wasn't going to do that. And Hurley said to Shackleton, "Boss, you're crazy. This is how you're going to pay for this thing when you get home." So that's what happened. So that's how he started this thing off. That was the advert in the newspapers. Imagine that today. Would you get away with that? So, and my dad, I'll talk a little bit now, but this was how he did it. And this is from my dad. Because my dad worked in his office for quite a long time, getting the thing going. So, and now as far as my father was concerned, he was a graduate at Cambridge. He'd just got his degree. He'd been in the Cavendish laboratory with a few kind of lesser known people like J.J. Thomson and Rutherford. Some of you may have heard of these guys. They sort of invented physics, and my dad studied under them. I mean, he was incredibly lucky, I guess, to do that. So he was wandering down the road in Cambridge, and he didn't know You know, he'd never been down this road and he didn't know why he was there. And somebody leaned out the window and he just shouted, "Hey, James, you want to go to the Antarctic?" And he sort of mumbled something. I'm not sure what he said, but he must have said yes, because he got a telegram a couple of days later from Shackleton saying, "Please come to London." So he went to London, and he had an interview with Shackleton, which was an interesting interview. Shackleton just asked him, he said, "Can you sing?" This is a physicist he's interviewing. My dad looked a bit puzzled. He said, "No, not Caruso, just can you shout with the boys?" My dad said, "Yes." And then he said, "You know, would you mind if you lost a finger or a toe?" My dad said, "No." And a few other simple questions. And he said, "You're on." He was the physicist on the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. And he had 3 months to get kitted out for this lot. Unfortunately, he was buddies with the physicist from Cambridge who'd been on Scott's expedition, the last one. So this guy gave him a shopping list and he bought all the necessary equipment. So we'll talk a little bit about the people now. He was the captain of the Endurance, and these people say he's the best navigator that ever lived. So I don't know, but that was it. Frank Wild was Shackleton's 2IC, you could say. They did everything together. I think he's one of the unsung heroes because he kept the party alive on Elephant Island. An amazing guy. He actually died in South Africa. He ran a pub somewhere up there and had a pretty sordid existence after that. And quite recently, I can't think of her name now, but a lady wrote a book on him, and she somehow managed to find his ashes somewhere up in the Transvaal, and she took his ashes to South Georgia, and they laid them down next to Shackleton. And another tough guy, a guy you want. You know, if you're out on a boat or in the Antarctic, you need these guys. He's one of those. Not much a guy like that can't do. You notice also all these chaps are dressed in Cape Union marked and you know, these things. So enjoy the dress. That was my dad in those days. And that was the ship. So it had a coal-powered motor as well, but obviously they couldn't use the motor indefinitely because you can't get coal supplies down south. She was an icebreaker. It was a Norwegian icebreaker and very, very strong and extremely well built. So as you can see, they're trying to sail through that lot. Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong one. What do I do? Try this one. So now put that in. That was HMS Endurance in 2008. They named the ship after that. And another little, I've got lots of little stories here, but I had a very sick wife, my first wife, and I was stuck in hospital with her just about 24/7. And whenever this thing docked in Cape Town, our family, because of the connection, got an invite to go down there. My brother couldn't go, luckily for me. And he said, "Why don't you go?" So I went down there, and I must have looked like hell. The ship was full of Defence Force personnel, and my business has always been selling to the armies, various things. So I knew exactly I could circulate with these guys, but I met the captain, Bob, and Bob was a submariner, tough guy, and been court-martialed and got off it, that sort of guy. And he looked at me, he said, "You look like hell." I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You do." He said, "Well, I'm having a tough time." And then he disappeared, and he came back again. "I think you need a sea cruise," he said. So, okay. I said, "Why don't you come south with us?" So I said, "Of course I can come south with you." And then his 2IC came afterwards and said, "When the boss says that's going to happen." 2 weeks later, I get an email from these people saying, "Can you meet us in the Falkland Islands?" So I went back and said, "Yes." So I got that same cabin there on the other side on HMS Endurance, and they took me south. And their aim was to land me on Elephant Island. God knows what it cost the Royal Navy. Only condition was they could use the photos for publicity. So I've actually done or seen a lot of what the old man saw. That's why I put that in there. Anyway, back onto Shackleton. A huge amount of what I'm talking about is going to be Shackleton. And you know, he went south. His first expedition, first time he went was with Scott. And they didn't get on too well, I don't think. And then later he started his own expedition. And he got within 100 and something k's of the pole, pretty close. And but he knew, he could understand what he was doing, and he turned back because they wouldn't have enough food, otherwise they would have died, which is exactly what happened to Scott. They got to the pole and they died on the way back because they starved to death effectively. So Shackleton didn't do that. So this was his big thing, was he knew how to run the show so that it would work, or so that they could at least live out of it. And my dad talked a lot about Shackleton decisions. So that was more or less what the story was. And now we can just start going south. They got to, my dad didn't sail on the Endurance until he got to South America. He joined the Endurance in Buenos Aires. In Buenos Aires, I think the ship had a very bad crossing. There'd be a lot of problem with the crew. Shackleton got there, they fired a lot of the crew. They took on a stowaway unknowingly and left, and with my dad and the other scientists for South Georgia, which was going to be where they would stop. They found a stowaway, a chappie called Black Barrow, on the way out, but he stayed on there. Shackleton kept him, so he went south. So that comes up a lot, so I put it in now. A huge amount we talk about food, because food was a big problem, and that was one of my dad's things. What happened here, I found a paper he'd written for the Philosophical Society in 1940, so I stole a lot of stuff from there. This gives you an idea of earliest pictures. When I showed that to the helicopter crew on the HMS Endurance, they couldn't believe how much that glacier has, since then, has receded. But this is just an idea of the conditions. It was a really bad year down there. I'm just going through them just to give you an idea what Shackleton came back across. And I put these in because penguins keep coming up. You'll see that scenery, and my dad called that summer. These are his titles, which I took out of the photograph album that he got from the expedition. So that's the gang going south. Gives you an idea of what they were heading for. It gets worse and worse. Open pack ice. Those are the dogs. And you can see the scientists, crew, everybody had to spend a huge amount of time cleaning that snow so the ship could just stay afloat, apart from anything else. I just saw the other question he asked. I'd forgotten it. Have you got good teeth and have you got varicose veins? There were two more questions. These are typical early pictures, all of them. They're famous pictures and they're incredible when you consider these were taken in 1914. And this is the sort of thing he would do. He would take the whole damn lot up to the crow's nest and do them. So this is still quite easy days as they're going south. That's Worsley. And he didn't have to talk. If he wanted to go left, he just swung that thing and it was left. If he swung it the other way, it was starboard. And that was the first land they saw. Coach land, true ice. And I put that in because it looked nice. And here we start the problems, held up. Heavy pack ice, lots of these. He was a geologist, Wordy, also from Cape Town, from Cambridge. My dad and him were buddies right through life. I met him when I was a youngster in Cambridge. We were there for a visit, and he lent me a bicycle. Funny enough, his granddaughter has also been in Cape Town, or was for a long, long time. So he carried on doing lots of exploring. If you followed geology and exploring, you would come across his name. You can see Cape Storm again, a busy year, and these are the real explorers, these chaps. they've all, I mean, Crean has got incredible experience, and the other one too. That's the boss. And the dog. And that's January 1915. And trying to free it. Now, the big thing now is, you know, they were trying to get to Varsel Bay. That's what he wanted to do. So Shackleton still thought he could free the ship. As you can see, they're cutting the ice, pushing, and getting nowhere. He was very good at this sort of thing, kept his crew going. Nobody had time to sit around and worry. There was stuff happening all the time. These are the right words: brash, young, consolidating ice. That's February 1915. Pressure hummocks, which they worry about all the time. And that's what they called Northumberland Avenue. That was so they could find the ship again. Weather would come over incredibly fast, and so there was a rope, and there was one on the other side too. So they could get back to the ship. They turned, as long as they turned the right way. That's young ice, and that's very dangerous apparently, because that just collapses as the big stuff moves in. So there's a lot of study of ice. This is another one. This is a flash photograph, which Hurley took, and the way they did that was with trays of magnesium, and all the scientists had to stand around with the trays and light the magnesium, and he would get his exposure from that. So now we hear this word pressure a lot, a hell of a lot, and you see the blocks rafting up. So now they're going to winter there. So what they did, Chippy was the carpenter, and he changed the whole ship. They ripped the inside of the ship out, made it into accommodation, so they could actually live there comfortably, as opposed to using it for transport. They prepared to winter. He made sleeping cubicles. He built bunks in, some for two, and the quarters for the scientists were known as the Ritz. That's Hurley, the Aussie guy, photographer. That's his sledging team. He was a tough cook. He was very inventive as well. He made the blubber stove that allowed them to live as well. He was also a bit of a crook with some of his photographs, and my father couldn't handle that. My father would have absolutely cracked if he saw what I can do with Lightroom and stuff like that. He didn't believe in butchering anything. A photograph was a photograph, and Hurley did quite a lot of stuff. But there we are. That was food. So it's up there now. Anything to do with anything like that was immediately collared, killed, and you didn't have to freeze it. It was automatically done. That was Shackleton's cabin. The boss's cabin, as he called it. He was a biologist. And the rookery was their laboratory, and that's my dad there. And you'll notice he's playing with a theodolite there. The big thing now is navigation. Where the hell are we? Because now this thing's drifting. And as you saw on the map, it drifted miles and miles. So obviously the big problem is, what the hell's the time? Because they've got these chronometers. They had 8 chronometers or so, small ones and a couple of big ones. And they're all clockwork, and they've now been away. This is now sometime in the middle of winter. They've been away over 6 months, so that it was a big problem to navigate. Where the hell are we? So my dad, he'd heard about occultations, which I expect you all don't have to explain what they are. And so he found in the library sufficient information to study what they really were, and the Nautical Almanac that they had on the boat gave the times of various occultations, and he found an old telescope somewhere there, and he mounted it on a tripod, I don't know, probably wire and stuff, and so he could see the moon very clearly, and together with Worsley, they could climb the occultations. And that's how they reset the chronometers. When there was going to be a star and there was going to be a clear sky. I mean, it sounds easy, but it wasn't. So that's what they did. Also, he used a theodolite for navigating. Worsley, of course, used a sextant. So, but my dad, because on the ice, you don't really have a horizon. So, but my dad did it with a theodolite, and you see him there with it. Funny thing about that, when we lived in Rondebosch, somebody gave him a theodolite, an old one, just exactly like that one. We spent 2 days positioning number 5 Malville Road in Rondebosch. So there we are. That's the laboratory, or rather the Ritz. This is where they ate as well. That's my dad there, and they're all doing their scientific stuff. It wasn't that easy for some. Wordy, the geologist, of course, didn't have many rocks. And so on, although they did put down things every day. Catherine knows about what I'm going to say here. You see the peas. I was giving this talk to a bunch of old ladies at the Provost Club in Hard Bay a few years ago, and they asked, did they fly the peas in, the fresh peas? I said, yeah, the Wright brothers did. She shut up after that. The dogs got very important. They built kennels for them off the ship, and that's feeding them during winter. They also had to weigh them, make sure they were all doing all right. And now we're in July, and the worrying starts a whole lot, huge amount of worrying. I put that in, this picture, and you'll see why later, why I put this particular one in. That's Worsley, and that's my dad with a theodolite. And they're doing their thing. He's got the watch in his hand, chronometer, whatever he's recording the time with. And that's probably the most important thing they did. And of course, you will have read that they found the ship. And that's how they found it, because of that. Here it is. That's a very famous picture. All of us, James family, have got it up in our houses. Again, done with flash. Another one. The quality is not quite so good on this one because I found it in a book. What happened with these pictures, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but they made an IMAX movie of this expedition. And my son, Simon, who was in America, and he's a yachty, or he was at the time, and he was at New York Yacht Club with somebody. And there was this lady giving a lecture like this. And he was able to stand up and say, my granddad was there. Anyway, one thing led to another, and her and her boyfriend, who was making the IMAX movie, got in touch with us. And because Simon said, we've got all these photos. And so they spent God knows how much to some German photographer in town, and he photographed every single picture from my dad's album in incredible detail. And part of the contract was, apart from the fact we got a few bucks for it from the film people, the whole family got a complete set of photos, which meant I could scan them. That's how we got these. So the returning sun, now they're quite nervous now because the returning sun, because that means the ice is going to get hugely active again. The dogs keep coming into this, dogs exercise. Hurley also did a movie on this, and there's some incredible movies. You can actually see them, you can find them on YouTube. He did some of the very, very first movies that were ever done. These are the dogs. I actually put these in for the ladies in the Provost Club, and of course, they ate them. So they don't like that when I tell them about that, but they did. My father had a university luncheon, and this lady was sitting next to him, and she was moaning about the meat. She said, it tastes like dog. My father said, it doesn't. Dog tastes rather better. They had to, because they couldn't feed them, on the subject of the dogs. So Shackleton, what they did, the guys had to actually eat their own dog team. And it worked quite well, because then they couldn't blame anybody else. I think that was his theory. That's what they did. It's early again, and that's the whole gang. August 1915, and now we're getting melting time starting. And if you read, as my father said, food was good, life was comfortable but monotonous. Fortunately, the scientists were kept busy with routine observations. So they had no sun from 2nd of May on, complete darkness. Of course, 3 weeks it was dark enough to see small stars at midday. That helped the navigation, I guess. So he wrote that polar ice fields consist of vast mosaics of heavy old floes joined by newer ice, all covered with wind and blown snow. These composites are usually in tension because of the snow load. Wind and currents cause sudden cracks, sometimes miles long. Without warning, such a crack may widen into a lane of open water. Then this freezes and new ice may be a foot or more thick within a couple of days. So it grows from within. And then the wind and current comes and everything crumples and cracks. And it gets very, very noisy. Pressure again, pressure hummocks. That's Shackleton a while, and they're obviously having a very gloomy conversation there about what's likely to happen to the ship. Heavily pressed area again. Back to science, that's Clark and Wordy. Every day they took samples from the seabed, and doing that they proved, apparently in those days they thought there was a huge island in the middle of the Weddell Sea. They sailed right across it and measured depths up to 3,000 meters or whatever. Food and for penguins. They were living on those, severe pressure, and maybe we can get out, they're wondering, but probably not. They evacuated the dogs first, completely. And you could see they're pretty busy here. And that's Shackleton. The working crack. He's worrying, are we going to get out of here? Another working crack, September. They're all puzzling. And you can see she was very strong, but she was under huge pressure from the back. And then at this stage, they had massive damage to the rudder and various things like that. Here it started getting a bit uncomfortable on board. And he wrote, I'm just going to read what he wrote here. With spring came more frequent, noisy and active ice movements. These are all from his diary. Several times the ship was badly squeezed and shaken, but suffered no vital damage until the end did not come until October 27, when after an attack lasting about 4 days, during which the pumps were manned continuously, the ship had to be abandoned, full of water, crushed out of shape, supported only by the pressure of ice against her sides. You can see this is what was happening. She stayed like that for about 3 weeks, and down she went in about 10 minutes. The ice closed up again, leaving practically no trace of a former presence of the ship. That's what I just read to you. And there it was. Have a good look at these pictures, because you know some of you have seen what was in the press, I'm sure. I mean, what they found was unbelievable. That's wild, having a look. And down she goes. That one again I got out of a book, unfortunately. And so the next thing now, it was survival. So they produced Ocean Camp. Again, that position that you see there, when it went down, that was 6 miles out, by the way, after 6 months with the equipment they had. So now they've got to carry on drifting, and the big worry now is where are we going to go? Because if we go east, we've got a problem. The nearest land is Cape Town. If we go west, then there's a chance that places we can go like South Georgia or like Elephant Island or so on. So that was the big worry now. And keeping alive. There's Ocean Camp. As you can see, they got very well organized. Shackleton there, that's wild again. look out, hoping to see some land. And there, again, once again, the theodolite, not far away. That's the blubber stove that Hurley made out of oil cans, and that's cutting up seal meat. So they didn't have enough food, by Dad's words, but seal meat and penguin meat would probably get them through. They were hoping. They had a whaler and 2 lifeboats. The whaler was the one that James carried, and they set up ocean camp. But they knew they were terribly worried where they were going to go. A German ship had gone to the west, and they were hoping that would happen, but they didn't know. If they might break out where it would be impossible to reach land, he wrote here, the nearest land might be Cape Town, 3,000 kilometers to the leeward. So drift largely depended on wind, and it was a continual topic. And I made a note here that my father always knew where the wind was coming from, and so do I, by the way. I spent a large portion of my life setting yacht races. For some reason I could do it, because I know where the wind's coming from, and I know where that came from, and I know where it's going to come from as well, and I don't know why. So there you are. I found the diagram the other day of the blubber stove, even drawn. And then Shackleton thought he can trek now, so we're going to pull these boats. I mean, it's incredible when you see what they're pulling, plus all their stores, plus everything. This was done by Marsden, who was the artist, and this gives you an idea of what they were trying to do. December now, 24th. That's a year. They've been now in the ice just about a year. There's the kitchen and the blubber stove. Christmas night, washings out to dry, sleeping bags out to dry. That's the James Caird that they crossed the sea in. He called it the first galley. This was Patience Camp. And he got a brand new galley there for feeding 28 men. And as you can see, it's in the middle of nowhere. So this was the big problem that they had. This was this disease, anemomania, is where the hell's the wind coming from? And my dad wrote that, morbidly anxious about the direction, and we gibber about it. So yeah. So we make all kinds of theories about, based sometimes on what we see around us, but more often on nothing at all. Anyway, our horizon's a few miles, and the area of the Weddell Sea is roughly 200,000 square miles. A tiny bug on a single molecule of oxygen in a gale of wind would have about the same chance of predicting where it was likely to finish up. That's a physicist talking. So my dad, they were going west, and my father thought it's probably because the rotation of the Earth causing the drift to be that way. So probably 10 degrees, he thought maybe 10 to 15 degrees west of where it would normally have drifted if Earth hadn't been turning. Food was a big thing there. What's wrong one? Yeah, just to refresh our memory, we did this whole thing down here, and we're now in this section here. We're now drifting up. That's November, we're in about December, and we're getting somewhere here. And all the way up here, they're wondering, when can we launch the boats? And if we can, where the hell are we going to go? Yeah, dreams were a big thing, food dreams, you see. My dad had a sweeter tooth, I think. You know, you've got to realize they're eating seals, penguin, and they finished the dog. You know, so, and they had a few biscuits and stuff, but very little else. But the funny thing, there was no scurvy at all. And a lot of people ask me about that, and I don't really know why. But there was hardly any illness at all. They had a little bit of surgery on Robben Island, excuse me, Elephant Island. So they did break free finally, April 1916. And that gives you an idea of what they were sailing through. These were, I took these extracts out. They were, daytime they were in the boats, nighttime they were on the ice floes, floating. They would get the boats up on the ice floes or next to them, and they would try and sleep. And the big problem was cooking and water, very little water, and praying for a southeast wind. That gives you an idea of what they did come nighttime. Not that there was a lot of night then in April. And the one time the ice floe split right down the middle, Shackleton leaned over and pulled one of the guys out of the water himself. But Shackleton and this guy were on the wrong piece of flow, so they had to somehow get the boat and get them off it. And so obviously quite nervous. I thought that was quite interesting to put in a little bit about fear. All boils down to food. See, one's concerned almost entirely with the present. You're annoyed at being cold and wet, and you want to be warm, and you want food. So you don't worry about what may happen even in the comparatively near future. Now these guys are sitting in boats. Don't forget, no radio. The only radio they had was none of you will know what a crystal set is probably, but we used to build them when we were kids. It had a diode and a coil and a capacitor. That was it, and an aerial. And they were trying to get spark transmissions from wherever. It didn't work. I've got a circuit diagram of it, actually. I found it. I went to Cambridge to the Scott Polar Research Institute, and one of my souvenirs was a photograph of my father's crystal set circuit. Yeah, that's April the 9th, another camping thing by Marsden. I think some of these are incredible just to show. Now Shackleton, he's in charge of this thing, and he's got 28 guys there. It's not just him. So I won't dwell too long on it, but I wanted this because this is where they left at about 7, and with nut food, breakfast and biscuits, and drink there was none. And that's how they fixed it. Anyway, they were heading for Elephant Island, and a whole lot of detail, which I'll skip, or we won't have time. But there are a lot of little things here. Everybody from the west sails hoisted another bid for the land for time appeared nearing, the wills in tow, docker independently, they'd lost her. And so it went. So suddenly there was land on our port bow, great headlands, and the possibility of landing, very little choice. And they were coming up here. This is Elephant Island, and they're going to land here. They managed to get to Cape Valentine. We're going to talk a lot about Point Wild while I'm on the map. That's there. But that was their first landing in over a year. And there they are. That's where they managed to land. Kind of rough spot, say the least of it. Okay, sorry, I just...
See, there's a request from the guys who do, if you do have a map and say things like here and there, you can just sort of say on the left and right hand, just so they can't see your pointer.
Fine. Sorry. They can't see the pointer. It doesn't make it easy. I could have done it on here.
No, that's right.
But I'm not a computer wizard like you guys. Anyway, that's where they were, and it was on the extreme eastern side. And my father wrote a few things, but I just wanted to put that up. Half the party was suffering from exhaustion, exposure, 5 days of hard work without sleep or rest. Some couldn't carry gear up the beach, mostly hardly knew whether to laugh or cry. We didn't know until it was released what a strain the last few days had been. We were at least on land after 170 days of drifting. That's quite a long time since the crushing of the ship. We took a childish joy in looking at the black rocks and picking up stones. We've stepped on no land since then. And there they are. Our first hot drink. Quite a rough-looking bunch, don't you think? There we are. We had a big meal of hot steak, blubber. We pitched tents on the beach, and we slept as we've never slept before. Dead, dreamless sleep. Wet sleeping bags lulled by the croaking of penguins. Okay, now this is how I did it first time. I'm in a Lynx helicopter, and we sailed across the Drake Passage, and we got to Elephant Island, and the first job of HMS Endurance was put Viv on the ground. That was the plan. So we were having a good look from the helicopter. We had the door off, and I had my camera. And that's what I saw. That's where they landed. I mean, I didn't know what to say. My picture. That's Cape Valentine from the Lynx, 6th of January. It looked very nice, but the weather was so bad that we couldn't land. The downdrafts were so bad, the chopper pilots weren't going to do it. They actually had 2 choppers up. I don't know what it cost to fly a chopper per hour, but it was just for me. And that, I put that in there. That's where they finally ended up. They couldn't stay there, so Wild took a boat, one of the boats, and they rowed up until they found us, or sailed until they found a spot, which Wild reckoned would work. And that was that one. Pretty bleak, isn't it? And that's me. It's all my official gear. You know how long it takes to get dressed for being exposed to the elements. Anyway, there it is. And I was lucky enough to land there, but I landed on the 18th of January, 19th of January, beg your pardon. We couldn't, the first time he gave up and said, okay, but we'll do it on the way home. And we went down there for another 3 weeks and did their work. And then on the way back, we decided to do that. And on the same day, they did land me there. And we found the wreck of the Explorer, which was a cruising ship which had sunk some years ago. And we had all their fancy survey stuff, and we found it. And except we thought we'd found it, and we weren't sure. So on the way back, we checked that we'd found it. So it was quite an exciting day. But that gives you an idea of where these guys had to come in with those small boats. We were on a rubber duck. I had a Royal Marine with me to keep me alive because I was over 60, and over 60s aren't allowed in Royal Navy boats. But Bob Taven didn't care. So, and we had the bosun, we had his favorite beret on, and we had the photographer. We had 5 cameras, big things, beautiful things. And my camera, I left my nice camera on the boat, and I brought a little Sony thing. And she said, I can't use my cameras. And I whipped the Sony out, a little thing like that. And she took that picture from the rudderback as we're coming in with the outboard up, because there were so many rocks and stuff, and we were surfing the waves on the rudderback. And that was the first thing I saw. And that was the guy that rescued them. He skipped the tug, and the Chileans built that statue on Elephant Island. And there it is, still there. And of all the photos the Navy used for my visit, for the publicity, this thing was my little Sony camera that the photographer took. Yeah. I'm very pleased with that. I'm showing you again, Cape Wild. That's where they land. This is where we came in, that picture you saw. You see the statues to the left-hand side is the statue. And just below this area here, that's where they camped. Oh, wrong way, let's go back again. That was their first attempt. I'll get away from me now. That was their first attempt, digging a cave. That didn't work. Shackleton said, okay, you guys must sort yourselves out, but I've got to get going. So the carpenter had modified the James Caird. He'd raised the gunnels. If you look right along the gunnels, you'll see there's a whole strip there that has been raised up. He canvassed it in. They ballasted it with rocks, which they took out after they'd launched it. And that was going to be their home for nearly 800 miles of sailing. That boat, you can still see it. I saw it 2 years ago for the first time, actually. It's in Dulwich College, Shackleton's old school. And it's been restored, semi-restored, and you can see it just like that. It's unbelievable. We're launching it. April the 24th, 1916, and in the water she goes. And then using the Stanker mills, they stored it, they provisioned the boat. Nearly finished at that point. And he's on the way. They had food, was penguin meat, seal meat. They had a little primer stove. They slept on the ballast, which were rocks. And that's the nautical almanac that they use. It's mine, I own it. My dad left it to me. And that's his notes there, nautical almanac used by Captain Worsley on the James Caird, Elephant Island to South Georgia. Given to me by Worsley. So I understand what do you do with a thing like that? I've got 10 grandchildren. So I took a decision and I gave it on permanent loan to this little museum on South Georgia. And I thought that's where it must go. And that's where it is now. So if you go to South Georgia, you'll see it's their pride and joy. I haven't a clue what it's worth, but it's probably, I could probably retire on what that thing's worth. You can see that's all this, that's exactly it. The pages have gone. It starts at June now. I mean, the actual page he used didn't survive, but that's all blubber and stains. It's a hell of a mess. So there's one page missing from there, and I gave that to a friend of mine, Anthony Stewart. Some of you may have heard of him. He sailed a 22-foot boat around the world from here, back home again, the whole story. And he wasn't my son, but he was just about, and I stuck it in a little film canister and did the whole trip with him. He reckons that all saved him because he got shipwrecked in the middle of it. He lived off fruit and stuff in an Indian Ocean island before he got rescued. He had to go back and start again from there to finish it. Anyway, there it was. So that's a little story there. And these guys, they got to Elephant Island. My dad called it the great boat journey. I said when we waved goodbye to the James Caird, many of us thought that they would never see the 6 men again. They reckoned without Shackleton, Worsley, the navigator. They reckoned without Shackleton, Worsley, the navigator, and their crew. McNish's set to work on the James Caird. What he said, he raised the sides, decked it in, and all the rest of it, like I told you earlier. And 16 punishing days under sail in the Southern Ocean, they reached South Georgia. That's 1,300 kilometers northwest of Elephant Island. My dad wrote, finding such South Georgia under such conditions was an amazing feat of navigation by Worsley. They could easily have missed the island and perished. Anyway, having got there, they found, and where they got to, I've just got to King Haakon Bay. That was the wrong side of the island, or this whole area is where the whaling places were. So he had to cross this lot from here. This dotted line is Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean crossed that. When they landed, the carpenter, Shackleton took the carpenter because he was a bit mutinous and he didn't want the carpenter to stay on Elephant Island. Anyway, the carpenter put nails from the James Caird into their shoes, into their boots. The things they've been wearing on the boat for the whole trip put nails through them. So they stuck out, so they didn't slip in the ice. And those guys, with one primer stove, and they crossed that island. It's incredible. How the hell they did it, I don't know. They crossed, my dad wrote, across the mountain chain, forming the backbone of the island in the clothes they wore, with one rope from the Caird and ice boots modified with screws from the Caird. 36 hours it took them to reach the strongest whaling station from where they were. Had never been done before, that crossing, by the way, until the 50s when the Royal Marine Expedition did it. So he then had to try and rescue people. In the meantime, back at home, the island, that's the gang. They're there, quite as youthful as he did. And so a whole lot of them. And they had to survive now. That gave you an idea of what it's like. If you across the island. Roundabout on the right-hand side, where that long icicle, behind that area is roughly where they stopped. And that's the glacier, which that music all the time was huge chunks of ice falling off that lot. If any of you, I'm sure a lot of you have heard glaciers falling. And they make a hell of a noise. And that's what they slept in, the two upturned boats. They had to shelter for the weather. So they built two walls of boulders. The boats are placed side by side, with the bow on one wall and the stern on the other, and the sides fitted with canvas. Floor was shingle, and the hut was weather tight. It was 2 meters high, but still it was double storied. So 22 men, 12 on the bottom, and 10 upstairs in the boats. My dad wrote, soon got used to the cramped quarters and developed ways of living in them. For instance, they went to bed for all meals. So that was the picture of it. Pretty rough. Life was monotonous, he wrote. Crude and rather monotonous. In bad weather, they couldn't go out for days. In any event, they could never get far from the hut because of the topography. It's a tiny place, a few hundred meters. So they read a few books, and they read them and they reread them. There's some had smuggled some books from there, including this Encyclopedia Britannica, some of them, some volumes. And my dad wrote, they used the less interesting parts of these to light the fire. But not everybody agreed with what was interesting. My dad saved an article on geometry, stained with seal blubber. My brother's got it. Well, he hasn't now. It's on show in England right at the moment. Absolutely, I expect it to stay there too. That gives an idea of life in it. He said, arguments developed about a location of a street in London, or where you could find a dragon's blood tree, or the difference between Greek and Roman churches. Without precise information, these could become very heated. Therefore, it was decreed the encyclopedia's decision was final. I didn't have Google. So personal relationships, he said, were interesting. On the whole, they had little trouble, but occasionally you got quarrels. You'd start to hate the sight of someone from whom you couldn't escape. The way he looked, the way he ate, the way he walked or sniffed became horrible. It was hard to keep quiet. And then usually you find somebody else, I took this straight out of his diary, you find somebody else with similar views to confide in. After this, the hate faded completely, and a new hate developed and a new alliance arose. And then he said, we all had beards of greater or lesser length and wildness. Our garments were variously patched, tattered, and greasy. Needless to say, we were all grimy. He always used to say to one another, don't worry, they can only get so much dirt on them. He says, coming back one day to the hut, we found everyone outside. The reason being that one of our number was changing his shirt inside. So that's where the hut, as far as I could tell, that's me standing exactly where the hut was at that particular point. As you can see, it's not very big. I was sort of crying when I see that picture. The penguins weren't that welcoming. I did mention that we did kind of when they went for me, I said, we eat you. Don't. And then these guys were really cross, but we had the bosun sorting that out. That's a pretty good view of it. That was where we were down there. This here, there's a little island further over here called Nomon Island. There it is. You guys know what a gnomon is, isn't it? In this place, somebody must know what a gnomon is. Yes, it's a sundial pretty. But very few people do know that. So. So that's really what happened on the island. It's quite incredible. Shackleton, cut it very short, Shackleton had 4 attempts at getting it. He started in South Georgia immediately. They couldn't get through the ice. He ended up in the Falklands. They had another attempt through the ice, I think 2 from the Falkland Islands. Then he finally ended up in Punta Arenas. And they sent out a tug called the Yelcho, which is a horrible little smoky tug. And the Yelcho got right through. There you can see, they saw the tug and they lit a fire, and Shackleton was on board. He didn't come off the boat. There wasn't time. Within a couple of hours, they were off the boat and gone as quick as they possibly could, and because he wanted to get out of there because the ice moved so fast. And that was, to give you an idea, I mean, we were just, the ice on Elephant Island was unbelievable when we were there, and it's moving all the time. So I could see exactly what was happening. That was in the middle of summer. That's the tug entering Punta Arenas. None of them had been allowed to clean up. They wanted them all dirty so the crowds could see. You know. So this was a bit of Shackleton showmanship. They all had to stay filthy until. So I think they really enjoyed their baths when they got there. So that's the governor and whatever was going on. You've got to remember there was a bloody world war going on at the same time. And the funny thing, I mean, it's still there. That is the Yelcho. It's been preserved, and it was still in service in the 50s. And they still, and they, having got to Punta Arenas, the only way they could get out of there was to sail all the way up to Chile, and they took the Yelcho. And they sailed that all the way up after this whole thing in South Georgia. It's very, very little written about it, but they, all of them sailed on that boat right up to Valparaiso or one of these places, and then across the Andes back. And they had to, and there wasn't enough fuel on that boat to do all that, so they had to barter for wood and fuel with inhabitants on the way, and all kinds of things. It's another whole story. So I thought we'd have some statistics here on penguins and seals. Skins and feathers burned for fuel, cooking for everyone, 10 Gentoo penguin skins per day. See breasts, you could have steak stews, hearts and livers, you could stew them. And up to the end of June, more than 1,000 penguins were used for survival. The nature boys will love that. And to kill, don't do this when you go to science town. To catch and kill, you surround them. As you hit them across the back of their beak with a club, which is anywhere else has little effect. And he wrote a little bit more. I read, it's remarkable how quickly he wrote, you lose the thin veneer of human, whatever it is, decency, once he'd killed the first couple of penguins like that and eaten them. So there you see, one Weddell Sea seal is equal to 50 penguins. So he worked all this lot out. So that was penguins and seals. And then I think we talked so much about Shackleton, and this is how he summed it up. So many men, miraculous that they got into the straits they did and they survived. And he wrote there, this was all due to that great leader, Shackleton. And behind everything was his presiding personality, making decisions upon which the survival of men depended, which by no means everybody agreed at the time. So detail was a big thing. And he was on top of everything. And then a mixture of generosity and caution and a poet at heart, and always his worst own enemy. But boy, everybody reckoned he'll get them out of it, and he did. So that was my dad's description. I don't think he was, I think once he was ashore and raising money for his expeditions, he was very good at getting money out of ladies, rich ones. We won't talk about how he did that. So I put that there to do it. Just on the scientific side, he said the main aim was geographical, crossing the continent and investigating the relationship of Graham to the rest of Antarctica. These were their plans. These were a complete failure. However, the existence of Morel Land, which still made its appearance in maps, was disproved simply by drifting across the position and measuring 1,000 fathoms of water where it should have been. As the camp drifted, they took soundings at daily intervals, 1,600 kilometers, and daily magnetic observations were made while with while they were with the ship, but all instruments were lost when the ship was crushed. Geology was hard, only rocks until Elephant Island were a few granite boulders. So those were the rocks. So James Weddell studied pack ice instead. He got results of great interest and value about its decay and drift. The sum was, however, small in comparison with what it should have been. I think it will be as a tale of adventure that our expedition will be clearly remembered. And that was it, I think.
Questions?
Oh.
Lots to do.
You mentioned earlier the geologic work, the occultation.
Yes.
So your dad was a physicist, and he became an astronomer.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is the title of the mission. Given that he became a very good astronomer, had to become one. Did later in life, was he interested in astronomy?
Okay, well,
Given that I'm from RW James myself, I'm an astronomer.
no, that's it. Sorry, Lee.
I'm from RW James.
It works in the building.
Yes, well, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I should have talked a little bit about that actually, because astronomy he was freakish about the stars always, and he was hugely friendly with Dr. Story and Dr. Jackson. And I grew up here where you guys work, with my playground on the weekend, because they'd all be having tea with Dr. and Mrs. Jackson and Dr. Story. I wrote a paper at school on radio astronomy. This was in 1958 or 57, and Dr. Story gave me all the data. That's why I was wandering around inside the main building. So he was very involved, and we were brought here to see the transit circle for the timing, for the noon gun, and the 20-inch reflector and all that. I knew all this stuff, and he built his own telescope as well, which we had a bundle lens from somewhere in the physics department, and there it was in a wooden box, a refractor, and, you know. So yeah, astronomy was a big thing with him. Yes, you're absolutely right. But he had a huge general knowledge of physics in all sides of it. I mean, he was a crystallographer, was his big thing, was X-ray crystallography. And they made him an FRS for his trouble. You know, he was one of two in South Africa. So, but you know, he worked with Bragg and these guys, Bragg and Solonis Bragg. And they would, you can't believe a little bit about the man. You know, he knew everybody who was anyone, and he was hugely well known. He was so quiet. I mean, I wasted my life not knowing more about him. But you know, we'd have for lunch. There'd be a guy there. His name was Sir John Cockcroft. He'd come for lunch at Rondebosch. And my dad said he knows about atom bombs. You know, and I asked, you know, I asked him a question, well, what do you put it in? He said, it doesn't matter, you can put it in a cardboard box. and you know, he was one of the main guys. And I can't think of the name of the other guy. I looked it up, and he was like the inventor of the damn thing. You know, and then he had two incredible students. The one was a guy called Cormac, and he used to rave about this guy, and he'd come to the house all weird hours and asking my dad things. And the scanners that you do, and then he got the Nobel Prize for the body scanners, you know, who hasn't had a scan. And that was Cormac. And he had another one, he's gone now, but he had two Nobel Prize winners out of there, and they were all guys that we knew, that he knew were going to do well. So he was very good at that. And then guys like Sir Lawrence Bragg would come in. You know, Sir Lawrence was a Nobel Prize winner. His dad was a Nobel Prize winner. And Sir Lawrence Bragg taught me to paint. Well, he didn't, because I couldn't, but watercolors. so you know, that's how it was. So there was all sorts of stuff happened through our lives that we didn't really know what was going on. You know? But now one puts it together. So yeah, he was an amazing guy. I had no idea he was just my dad. And then I'd be out knocking street lamps out of my catapult with him, you know. But that was him, you know. He was very, very much with it, I think. yeah, he's left his footprint, I think.
Yes. I was always sort of wondering, you go through something like that, was it visible to you late in your childhood or later in your life that he'd been through this momentous thing, you know, in his personality?
No, but you see, again, you guys can't talk like I can, but you know, if I think when I was at school in the 50s, and my dad was, you know, he fought in World War I. I mean, he came back from the Antarctic, and he ended up in Belgium, and his big thing was with Cylons, with Bray. And they worked out, they invented gun sound ranging, you know, where you put microphones in the soil and you can position the enemy guns. Funny enough, in my later life, I was hugely involved in selling telerometer survey equipment to armies for just precisely positioning gun sound ranging microphones. Anyway, so that's what he did for 2 years, but then he was too old to fight here. He was very involved in teaching and in DGAR ships in Simonstown. But you know, my pals, their dads have been in the war, France, with fire. We were surrounded by heroes. So, you know, the fact that he'd been to Antarctic wasn't really unusual. I mean, you think about the kind of guys that, you know, we all climbed the mountain with war surplus rucksacks and war surplus water bottles. Everybody had war surplus binoculars, and, you know, so we were surrounded with that by incredible people, or kids, or friends who had lost their dads. So we didn't, he gave quite a few talks every now and then, because he got a set of these slides like that, glass slides, which is all, they've also gone to London, to Cambridge. But so he would, and he would get the magic lantern, which is an arc light. And so then he would swipe that from university and give these shows. So he did quite a bit of that, like this talk to the. But otherwise, no. I mean, there's thousands of things I could ask him now.
Yeah.
So, but he wrote a hell of a lot in his diary. I mean, the diary is really readable, and we were very lucky because my brother, we only had one copy. My brother was trying to type it out, and then Leslie Jennings, for the physics department, you probably know Leslie, and she took it to my brother and said, "I'll do it." And she typed this whole damn thing up, got all the diagrams, and got it bound in the library at the university. So we've all got, the family all got a proper copy of the diary, so we could read it without trying to turn these messed up papers over. So, but yeah, it's a good question, because you know, I'm really sorry I didn't ask a whole lot more. I had to find it out and learn it. But I think I just want to go a little bit further. I said that's it. I'm wrong, of course. I've forgotten I had the gist of the talk. I mean, if you look at that picture, now that was a couple of months back, and look at that. That's, I put them together. I've forgotten I did that. There's the theodolite picture, and I mean the ship is in incredible condition. It went right down like that. I mean, we've had it's been very exciting for us, this whole thing, because it's all emerged all over again. I mean, these guys, I don't know if you know what they did down there, but it's an incredible thing. Some guys sponsored this expedition, £40 million, paid for the SAAO guys to go down south to find that ship. And the coordinates of where my dad worked out.
And they found it really nearby, didn't they?
They found it. They found it 6 miles away, which is nothing, you know, if you think, because it doesn't go straight down either. I mean, when we found Explorer, it was 13 kilometers from where they said it was, and that was, they did it with SatNav. So yeah, but they've never seen a wooden wreck in such good condition. These two guys, you can't believe how John Shears is the expedition leader, and the real motivator was a character called Mensing Bound from the Falkland Islands, and they got this thing sponsored, and they got this. I'm not sure which. I think it's a French machine, but it's incredibly. You know, they did it 2 years ago, and they lost the machine, the submersible. So that was a failure. God knows what that cost. Now they did it again, And we were lucky because I just thought, no, damn, we should do something about this. So I got on the internet and I found this, and I said, hey, you do realize there's a couple of old farts here who would like to be slightly involved in this. So they did involve us, and we spoke a lot to them on the ship. We did a Zoom talks, and my brother and I even got a Sunday Times full page on this thing. And anyway, so when they arrived back in Cape Town, they asked us to come down, and we spent an hour and a half on the quayside. We weren't allowed onto the ship because of COVID, talking with the two, Vincent Bound and Shears, and Christo, who drove this bloody machine. And they did print searches. And I said, how the hell, what are you controlling? He said, no, we got it through a cable. He said, we've got 24 kilometers of cable driving that thing. So he said it's absolutely incredible. Right? We can put it precisely where it must go. And we knew we were going to find the ship because we were confident of those, that the coordinates weren't too far out. And the other interesting thing, while on that subject, a whole lot of scientific people have been trying to improve on my dad and Hurley's calculations by recalibrating the chronometers with known star information. You'd know more about that than I do. But and so the whole paper was written and sent to them down south because it was just hadn't quite been published yet. On no, you're in the wrong spot. You've got to go 16 kilometers over somewhere else. They ignored it. So they told us. So we know we were going. And we knew it was going to be somewhere there. And apparently on the bottom it's very flat and very, very clear. It's crystal clear down there. And this guy, Christo, he's just raving about this machine. He says, but we want to do it again. Because they've got this little eye. You can drive it right up to the porthole and it can look, and they managed to look into Shackleton's cabin. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to get more pictures because they've got all kinds of deals with National Geographic and people, and Vincent Bound has been locked away writing a book. They gave him 3 months to write the book. So I before this one, I've been frantically emailing saying, please send me better pictures, but I didn't. But still, if you look at them, there it is. And they reckon it's sitting straight, flat. It must have just, and they were sure it would, because they reckoned with all that wreckage at the top, it would kind of, the weight at the bottom, it was going to stay upright, which it did. And that's it. So there are going to be something, yeah, that's the machine. And I said, well, how do you control the cable? He said, it's the tension cable. It is a very, very clever computer controlled thing which keeps the tension all the time exactly correct. So obviously it's driven by some fancy batteries and stuff like that. There wasn't time to talk a lot more. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just sort of struck by, you say you could have asked your father a lot more, but I think you and your family have done, history a really great service by being such sort of keen curators of all of this. So thank you very much for coming to share.
Well, the kids did, I think, my grandkids. I'd never thought about doing this. And one of the kids is at Wet Pups.
Yeah.
And my daughter, Jan, said, Dad, you've got to go and give a talk. I gave her the one talk. I don't know how many I've given.
You haven't stopped.
No, I did stop. It went completely quiet now until this. And so, somebody's going to talk to somebody. I'll probably give another one. It's fun.
Thank you very much.